Welcome to this edition of Security and Compliance Weekly. On our show today, we're speaking to Frank Macreery. He is the co-founder and CTO of Aptable, who happens to be our sponsor today. In our first segment, we're going to talk about, the cloud and about the impact the cloud migration is having not only on security, but compliance concerns for companies, particularly in terms of things like continuous monitoring, demonstrating compliance, to automate or not to automate, stuff like that. In our second segment, we're going to continue the discussion, shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit about how Aptable can help solve all these challenges. I think we might even get to see a glimpse of what Aptable looks like. So join us as we continue to tear down silos and build bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. It's the end of the quarter. You've got a mountain of compliance tasks to complete, daily requests from sales for security documentation, and an upcoming audit. You're waiting on evidence requests, and you can't find the policy you wrote last week. Compliance management is hard. Aptable Comply makes it simple. Comply is an end-to-end, purpose-built GRC platform to manage compliance. From automating evidence collection to integrating with your existing SaaS tools, Comply simplifies the hardest parts of managing compliance. Reduce manual processes and build trust with your customers. Visit securityweekly.com/Aptable to learn more. Cyber risk and compliance automation is finally here. Legacy GRC systems cannot simplify the complex use cases and deliver powerful automation that cyber teams need. CyberSaint's integrated risk management solution ingests data from your existing tech stack, dynamically lighting up controls using patented AI. Leverage your expertise and showcase business value. Let your risk and compliance solution work for you. See why the most forward-thinking CISOs of the Fortune 500 support their teams with CyberSaint. Maximize your cybersecurity program today. Visit securityweekly.com/CyberSaint SCW. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to episode number 50 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on November 3rd, 2020. It's Election Day in the United States, and quite possibly what I'd like to call the beginning of the apocalypse. But aside from that, I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, and joining me today are my co-hosts, Mr. Josh Marpet, Mr. John Snyder, and Mr. Scott Lyons. Welcome, gentlemen.
Yo, what's going on, man? Episode 50.
Another
Holy
milestone.
Cow.
50 episodes. It's like we're starting to get the hang of this.
Barely, just barely.
I think we're getting into the groove every once in a while. Dad jokes notwithstanding. Before we jump into it, do have a couple announcements. Security Weekly, in partnership with the Cyber Risk Alliance, is excited to present Security Weekly Unlocked on December 10th, 2020. This one-day virtual event wraps up with the 15th anniversary edition of Paul's Security Weekly live on YouTube, and we're all going to be together if we're not completely locked out of Unlocked because of coronavirus. We'll wait and see. You can check it all out on securityweekly.com/unlocked. View the agenda, register. It's free. There's no reason not to do it. In our next webcast, which is on November 5th, we'll show you how to build proper metrics and KPIs. Learn why you should stop trying to discover and classify data in our webcast on November 12th. Learn how to thwart attackers using deception in our November 19th technical training. All this you can find out about securityweekly.com/webcasts. Check the schedule, register, and of course, always you can find our previously recorded webcasts and trainings on securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right. Today, We're joined by Frank Macreery. As I mentioned, he is the co-founder and CTO of today's sponsor, Aptable. We met the CEO, Chaz, a couple weeks ago. I believe that was episode 44. So if you want to check out more, you can always go back and listen to that episode. We're talking about cloud migration, the challenges that companies are experiencing in terms of security and compliance, in terms of migrating, especially infrastructure to the cloud. Automation might be helpful. I think that's what we're going to talk about. But before we jump into it, Frank, welcome to Security and Compliance Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
We like to start off all of our interviews with guests, especially the first timers. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your career, how you got into cybersecurity, compliance, and how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in software engineering, specifically infrastructure and cloud infrastructure engineering. So I worked at a couple startups before Aptable in the capacity of individual engineer and director of engineering departments, where I did things like build ad server technology, build deployment platforms for small startup teams. And it was not until Aptable that I really got involved in compliance. And so what we initially were trying to solve at Aptable was a turnkey HIPAA in a box solution, where if you were a startup trying to deploy apps and databases in the cloud, we provided you with a platform where you could use our tooling and automatically meet all of the requirements and have all the proof you needed for HIPAA compliance. That was seven years ago, in 2013, and we've just expanded the footprint of what we cover in terms of security and compliance. So over that time, our customers have dealt with more and more frameworks. We've gone through several different audit frameworks ourselves, and we've learned more about what goes into compliance. And we built this vision of a platform for compliance automation as a completely separate problem than, say, security monitoring, or just generally checking the boxes of GRC. And so that's where we're at today. And my role is CTO, covering the technology behind all that.
All right, super. Thank you for that introduction. And of course, we also like to ask our first-time guests what we like to call the hot seat question. This is to give us a little bit of insight into, where you're coming from, sort of your philosophical approach to this thing we call security versus compliance. So the question simply is, where do you fall on what we like to call the security versus compliance continuum?
Yeah, I would say we, Aptable, and I fall much closer to the compliance end of the spectrum. But what we're trying to do ultimately is bridge the gap between these two disciplines. We believe, so we're not trying to reinvent the wheel for security monitoring. We believe that there is a lot of good security technology out there, but we don't think that there's any great connection between security software and compliance software. We also believe that some of the principles and workflows behind compliance, like risk assessments and using frameworks to identify all of your requirements from the top down, manual workflows to review, and governance processes, those are all actually really valuable and can augment a security program that's built from the bottom up. And so what we're trying to do is tie these two things together, provide a platform that integrates with your security monitoring and your cloud infrastructure tools, and overlay all of the compliance and governance on top of that, in an automated way.
Okay. Well, so the question that jumps out to me immediately as we kind of talk, shift gears and talk about our topic today, which is migrating to the cloud and putting more and more things in the cloud. I guess the immediate question that jumps out to me is how do we get companies to understand that there's a difference between security monitoring and compliance monitoring, that they're different, but that they're related, and that one does not necessarily assume that you're doing the other. I mean, I guess, how do you approach companies and say, hey, you've got a problem whether you know it or not, and we can help you solve it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you can look at a couple examples. So maybe looking at identity and access management. So as you move to the cloud, one of the most important problems to solve is how are you granting access to your workforce members to all of your cloud resources? And companies may be using a variety of solutions for this. They may be using 2FA solutions like Duo. They may be using centralized authentication management solutions like Okta. Those are great, but and we certainly recommend that every company uses those. But then there are pieces of the picture that get covered by compliance and by governance controls. So compliance and governance ask questions like, are all of my systems covered by centralized authentication management? Do I have 2FA enabled on every service? Are the permissions that I'm granting in Okta, are those appropriate for the roles that these team members are serving? Is there a governance process to make sure that that is up to date and that the Okta permissions are valid at all times? These are the sorts of things that we consider to be compliance questions, and we think that the best way to solve them is you plug into Okta, you plug into Duo, and you pull in that information and make it really easy to answer those questions and have visibility on an ongoing basis.
Shoot, I guess even a more basic question, and I'm speaking from a certain perspective. I'm debating whether I should try to make that counter 0 the whole episode, Scott. But how do you initially get companies that are migrating things to the cloud to understand that the cloud provider isn't going to magically make all their security and compliance concerns go away because it's all going to be taken care of for them?
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important for companies to understand and for companies like Aptable to educate about the division of responsibility. So it is true that when you move to the cloud, a lot of the security controls that you'd have to implement in an on-premise or a co-located environment, a lot of those are kind of covered by the cloud provider. So when you're running on AWS, you don't necessarily need to worry about things like physical access to infrastructure or any sort of physical safeguards. You don't need to worry about things like decommissioning disks when they're no longer in use. Those are things that you don't have access to, and you rely on AWS or GCP or Azure for covering those controls. But there's this whole layer of responsibility on top of that, how you use those resources, how you secure them. And in fact, when you move to the cloud, there are a lot of new important risks introduced, right? So accessing infrastructure that's hosted in physical premises that you control means that you don't have to worry about threats of access being compromised in between remote devices and those cloud services that you're using. So I think that in answer to your question, it's important to think of the division of responsibility, the pieces of the security model that are not taken over by the cloud provider, and the pieces that are newly introduced because you have this new access mechanism where you're going over the internet to access everything that lives in the cloud.
Okay. So I guess, and maybe this is something that you guys can help with in terms of your solution, but how do you get, I'm a company, I sign up for the cloud, I think I'm getting a whole lot more than maybe what I bargained for, or maybe it's more accurate to say I'm getting a whole lot less than I thought I was getting. But I don't necessarily know that I don't know that. How do you just sort of ease companies into trying to categorize, frankly, the things that they aren't getting from the cloud provider that more than likely are going to become an issue of being able to demonstrate compliance at some, later point. Let's say, just for instance, I'm a retail merchant, and I'm a small regional retail merchant, and I'm moving a lot of my infrastructure to a cloud-based provider. It makes it whole lot easier for my 100 stores in the Southeast to be able to connect together and do payment processing and do all that stuff. But I'm not saying it.
No, the real crux of the question there, Jeff, is that a lot of companies are either compliant now or they're compliant later, right? Now and later. Not trying to go candy on this. They're compliant now or they're compliant later. They're either cloud now or they're cloud later, right? So the real question is do you become compliant when you move to the cloud after you've done all of the work to show that you're actually doing the compliance, or do you become compliant before you go to the cloud and then add in the cloud controls to match the ROI for compliance, right? So there's really a couple of different ways that you can tackle that. Am I missing this?
No, I think that's totally valid. I mean, as a practical matter, so most of Aptable's customers are in the B2B space, so not B2C, and as a result, our customers are selling into other businesses, and when they sell into businesses that are larger than themselves, those larger enterprises or larger mid-market businesses will have a set of controls that they care about, and so it's in the process of closing that new business. That's when, if they haven't realized it already, like if they're not in the compliance now camp, they will be pressed for questions about what they're doing to meet all of the controls that the buying organization cares about. And for a lot of our customers, that's how they get introduced into compliance. It's a matter of building trust with their customers that forces their hand into that. So it starts with a security questionnaire and then grows into, a SOC 2 ISO 27001 compliance program.
And in continuing with the theme of the show of building bridges and tearing down silos, right? Compliance is not a 4-letter word, right?
No. Yeah.
No, it's more like 8 or 9 letters.
Or 3 letters. So how do you
PCI?
how do you help companies understand the ROI of security maturity through compliance, right? While still moving them into a brave new world of cloud with a shared security model if they've never approached cloud before.
Right. So, I mean, those are two big challenges in and of themselves, right? So, I would say that you got to tackle both of those, and the ROI is different and overlapping for the two. The ROI for cloud is the amount of scale that you can achieve, and in a lot of cases, the cost reduction that you can achieve by.
So some people say it's a cost reduction, but in previous years, it's actually been shown that it's a cost increase.
So I think I would say that you always look at the total cost of ownership, and so it depends on the size of the organization, and so the biggest cost that you're saving is the teams and the expertise required to manage those resources that would be living in-house versus the resources that you're delegating to the cloud.
That's extremely valid.
It's kind of like a rent versus buy model, and so or lease versus buy, and so in the very long run, it could be the economics could differ, but so. Yeah, I'm curious. What's the basis of the research that you're citing that says that the TCO is higher for cloud?
Well, the basis of research is companies that we've worked with, right? Where we've noticed that the cloud deployments have actually been higher than the on-prem, right? And it's not because you're deploying a single server, it's because you're deploying entire infrastructure and trying to watch all of the ingress and egress that's going into and out of the cloud, right? So when you're trying to deal with TCO, most of the calculators that are out there only deal with the server instance, and they don't say, well, you have to pay for so much traffic, you have to pay for monitoring, you have to pay for this, you have to pay for that. So in the end, in the end, from what we've seen, it's actually cost companies more than if they just bought a server and secured it on-prem.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, so the problem is that, as you want to scale that on-prem deployment, it gets more and more complex, and the costs greatly increase. And you don't have the unlimited capacity to scale that you would with the cloud. And so at the level of a single server, when we're talking a small deployment, the overhead of moving to the cloud can be high. But I would say that as it gets bigger and as that velocity of scale increases, that's where moving to the cloud can really help, because it removes most of the barriers and friction to scaling.
So you're saying it's a lot like dealing with a hockey stick when you're going from on-prem to cloud versus ROI and TCO.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, dealing with on-premise deployments in the past I'm just old enough to have worked at startups in New York that had on-premise deployments. And dealing with scale before the cloud, it was extremely painful. And I would say that's where a lot of the costs came in trying to navigate how to scale up our infrastructure when cloud wasn't an option.
Let me ask you a question then. How many times in dealing with those on-prem versus cloud deployments, how many times have you guys involved legal from a compliance perspective when dealing with the deployment?
So, I mean, certainly, like in the early days, I don't think that especially at startups and in the early days of the cloud, I don't think that there was as mature a model for thinking about security and compliance in the cloud. So, in 2006 through 2010 is the period that I'm talking about here, the very, very early days of the cloud. I would say very little. And then today, it's a different story. Today, this is what Aptable is in the business of doing, and many of our customers, they're simultaneously compliance now and cloud now. So that means that compliance and legal do get involved for any cloud migration.
Oh, yeah. For all, yeah. Well, at smart companies, let's be honest. At some companies, they're just like, let's throw everything in the cloud. Yeah. And they throw it there. They do lift and shift and, rack and stack, whatever the hell you want to call it. And they all of a sudden they're in the cloud. They're like, yeah, everything's perfect. And you're like, how do you access it? They're like, I don't know.
I don't know.
What's your break glass? Crap, we should probably set that up, shouldn't we? And my absolute favorite, okay, is, hey, when you were in your data center, you knew you had 15 servers, I'm making numbers up, 15 servers running, say, 100 different virtuals. You had, 70 people working on them. That's in your Active Directory and such. How many systems do you have now? How are you keeping track of your assets? And they go, our bill, I think. And the difference between them is fascinating. And when it comes to compliance, the same problem occurs. I would say that with cloud-based systems, you have certain advantages and you have certain disadvantages. Asset discovery or asset management becomes very much more difficult. However, obviously scaling, as you mentioned, becomes much easier. I think that there's a lot of compliance questions. No, that's the wrong word. There's a lot of compliance complexities that occur because of cloud, whichever cloud you want to talk about. And honestly, even private cloud has some of these complexities. So, dear God, Casper, I have no idea what you're putting up there. But anyway, Discord is fascinating right now. And by the way, Jeff, I don't know if you've noticed this, but people are begging you to say PCI so you can take a drink. Okay, so just go ahead and do it already, man.
The counter has already moved.
Well, say it again.
I typed it. So
he typed it.
Counter say it again. Moves. No, you must be verbal with it. It has to be verbal. So say it.
Say what?
Say it. Say it. Say it. Come on.
Well, not to distract, but we've been focusing on the complexity of getting companies to understand that security and compliance is a thing, even if they migrate to the cloud. I suspect that that's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is once they realize that they need to do something, what do they do and how do they know that they're doing it or not? And I'm guessing that's where Aptable comes in a little bit, Frank?
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea is, so part of compliance, part of every compliance system is coming up with a framework, a top-down system for understanding what you need to be doing, either based upon assessing risk, based upon a set of standard controls that apply to businesses that do your similar line of work. And so every customer who starts using Aptable starts from a framework or a set of frameworks that define the requirements, the things that they should be doing, the things that they should be tracking. And then we plug into the various cloud services that they're using to pull in data to perform that initial gap analysis automatically, show them what we have evidence for, what we don't have evidence for, what we have evidence for them not satisfying their controls. And so that's kind of the starting point for using Comply is, define your framework, define the things that you care about, connect to your systems to see what you're doing, what you're not doing, what we don't know whether you're doing, and then create all of the workflows to fill in the gaps and to remediate the issues that exist.
Well, not to pick on your words, but I'm going to pick on your words a little bit. In my experience, companies don't care about much. They only care about what they have to care about, which is whatever compliance standard they have to meet. It could very easily be the exception because I don't talk to every company in the world, every vertical, but there might be companies out there that really want to do security and compliance and do it well and do it right, and they do care. Not trying to preclude them, but to me, the more normal experience is companies are just, they have no clue what we're even talking about right now. They've signed up for something that they thought was going to do it for them, and then they're finding out the hard way, nope, you still have some responsibilities, and so they're doing what they have to do without necessarily not necessarily understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it, why they should care. So that was a very long-winded saying. I don't think companies care a whole lot. They just want to do what they have to do, so it goes away, and they can get back to selling widgets or whatever they sell.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so. I would say that is going back to what I was saying earlier. Most of the businesses that we talk to, they get into compliance because they're forced into it by the business that they're doing.
Sure.
But does the counter go up if I say it?
No, only Mr. Jeff.
No,
it's my counter.
It's only when Jeff says PCI.
So anyway,
what you're talking about, Frank, is most of your customers are what in a certain regulatory world would be considered to be service providers rather than merchants or retailers. So they're in a supporting role. And yeah, I would agree that we don't have to do it. We're not a merchant, but we're supporting the merchant. So guess what? We have to do it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So so some people get into it because they absolutely need to, because they're a merchant and they need to do PCI DSS. Others get into it because their customers are asking them questions. They're taking a lot of time to fill out questionnaires. They're losing deals because their competition has a SOC 2 report or has ISO 27001 compliance. And so it's that this kind of need to build trust in order to close business that drives them in. So they'll start preparing for SOC 2. And I think you're correct. Like at the beginning, they're definitely just trying to meet the bare minimum. And with Comply, we're not stopping them from doing that. We're trying to make it as clear as possible, starting from that top-down set of requirements for SOC 2 or PCI. Here are the things that you absolutely need to do. But in establishing, in kind of like establishing governance processes, establishing procedures, connecting and building up your security monitoring, and then tying that into compliance automation, you end up saving the effort that it takes to stay compliant with PCI or SOC 2 and reduce the effort you spend on audits every year. And so you end up, the audit itself can often close new business for you. And then with investing in compliance automation, you can reduce the time that you spend getting to that level of compliance. And if you invest even further, compliance can augment your overall security posture too. So that from a risk-based approach, you're protecting your entire business from some of the risks that these frameworks are intended to cover. They're not intended to just be, like box checking charades. The whole intent is to provide a structured framework for managing risk in very complex systems.
Wait. You're saying that compliance is not just checkboxes? What are you, some kind of progressive or something? Come on.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy to think.
All right, so
you go ahead, Jeff.
Scott.
I'm sorry.
No,
I was going to say I have a little bit of a curveball question for you. And this might be a difficult one to answer. We've had other companies come on the show and say, well, we do compliance, we do risk assessments, we do this, that, and the other, right? Aptable has this automated product that's supposed to help companies along the journey of compliance, right? What can you tell us that delivers Aptable to be able to catch everything in the compliance sets, right? So we've had other people come on the show and say, yeah, we do this, right? Why Aptable? What do you want us to know that puts your product ahead of others in the market, in installs, in the way that they're doing things now? Like, how would you frame that?
Yeah. So there's some things. So if you're buying compliance software, you're usually buying what's called GRC. And so Comply gives you all of the common sets of tools that you would expect from GRC. We give you a way to manage your risks, a place to store your controls, a place to document the policies associated with those controls. We give you a place to tie all of those controls and risks back to requirements in the various frameworks that you're audited for. We give you ways to respond to audit request lists and security questionnaires. But on top of that, we have a system of integrations and a API that you can integrate with yourself so that you can connect to all this cloud services that you're using and automatically automatically check those boxes that you need to check for each one of those requirements. So in traditional GRC, you'd be, assigning out tickets to collect evidence for how you're securing your AWS infrastructure. With Comply, you'd connect to AWS either via our turnkey integration or by, if you want, you can write a client on your end and just post whichever data you want to our API. But then once you've set that up, you're automatically checking those boxes, and you don't have to be assigning out tickets to your workforce and wondering whether they're going to get done because it's all automated.
So is it automated in the SOAR, security, orchestration, automation, remediation market, or is it automation inside of GRC?
So it's it bridges those a little bit. So it's
Okay.
We're certainly covering the remediation portion. So it's not just evidence collection. It's not just mapping that part, because a lot of the evidence that you need to collect is proof that you have that you're continuously improving and that you're remediating issues that you find. And so a common workflow for Comply could be, connect to your MDM provider, monitor for exceptions that are found to your controls, and then create tickets that are tracked in Comply that you can see who's responsible for this. There's accountability, and you can track the remediation end to end until our automatic integration with your MDM provider detects that the issues are resolved.
So it's automated GRC, is right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. How are you solving problems that other GRCs aren't? And the automation we know, but like other problems that GRCs aren't, like being able to stay on top of people.
Yeah. So I mean, basically the way this works with Comply is you set up automations one time. So you say, okay, whenever you see this set of issues related to device management, we're going to assign responsibility to this IT lead. They own those tickets. They can reassign them and delegate them as needed. But we're going to give you, as a security officer, a single dashboard where you can see who's assigned what's the status, and you can remind them. And the system itself will automatically remind them. And we'll connect to the tools they're already using. We connect to Jira, we connect to Slack for notifications.
Yeah, that was actually going to be the next question, was what are the integrations that you guys have done?
Let me jump in real quick. Yeah, let me jump in. Let's take a break real quick. And I think you've piqued all of our interest, especially some people on the Discord server. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll continue the discussion. And Frank, maybe you can start showing us a little bit about what you're talking about. So hang on. We'll be right back.